Our gospel lesson this morning comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 23, continuing the Christmas story. Now after they had left, that being the wise men, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
First of all, let me say thanks to Will for the opportunity to preach once again here at Mount Jefferson while he's enjoying what I'm sure is a much-deserved break with his family. However, I can't say that I appreciate the fact that you folks follow the lectionary and that he has left me to preach this wonderfully uplifting text from Matthew's Gospel. The good news for today from Matthew's Gospel in headline form: Herod goes crazy and murders innocent children in and around Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary and Jesus barely escaped to Israel, to Egypt. And this one, the scriptures are fulfilled. So where's the good news? The gospel in today's passage. Can we really be satisfied with the story that child Jesus lived while hundreds of other children were murdered? Yay? Good news? Rejoice? There has to be more to this story. Something, as is often the case in reading these ancient texts, that requires hearing and understanding on a deeper level. Digging into the context and realities of those who were hearing the story at the time when the words of Matthew's gospel was being written and first spoken, or even perhaps hearing it from the perspective of persons in a very different circumstance than the one we now find ourselves in even today. So let's explore context and character in this story. According to scholars, Matthew's gospel was written for the Jewish Christian community, Jewish becoming Christian or deciding community in and around Galilee following the destruction of the temple that occurred in 70 AD. Many in this community were refugees from Judea, now in Galilee, and were struggling to come to grips with their reality following the decimation of the cultural, religious, and ritual center of their lives and the lives that they had known. Their world had been turned upside down, and they were struggling to find some sense in the senseless and chaotic reality of now. They were refugees seeking meaning and hope in the midst of what seemed to be a dark and disturbing time. Among Matthew's primary efforts in his gospel is to show clearly how Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophetic tradition of Israel. The gospel writer makes great effort to connect Jesus by lineage all the way back to Abraham. That's how Matthew's gospel begins. Abraham, the father of the people of Israel. He structures his gospel as an echo of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. Each step in this story of Jesus, from birth to death, relates to an image of the Torah and subsequently fulfills elements of the prophetic tradition. Jesus had come, Matthew argues, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. This community to which Matthew's gospel is spoken and written and told was struggling to determine which path they would follow. The Jewish path being reformed by the Pharisaic and rabbinic traditions, this movement of renewing the law, or Jesus and the Christian movement. This path proposed by Matthew's gospel, that Jesus was the fulfillment of the law, the Messiah. It wasn't a question for this community of whether they would be Jewish, for they were Jewish. But more the question was how they would be Jewish, now that the temple, the central element of Jewish life, ritual, and identity, was gone. Therefore, this story of the refugee Jesus speaks clearly to the reality of the community for which the Gospel of Matthew was written. This Jewish story tells the Jewish story, and you know it in the Old Testament, tells again and again and again of the narrow escape of a people from the violent destruction and annihilation at the hands of power gone mad. And here it is again. To be legitimately the leader of the Jewish people, Jesus himself must also narrowly escape. In this case, Herod, one of their own, a faux Jewish king and puppet of Roman rule, recreates a massacre of biblical proportions by killing all the children under the age of 2 in and around Bethlehem. All those children who might possibly be this Jesus that the wise men spoke of. This would-be king prophesied and recognized by the wise men of the East. For Matthew's audience, the Herodian line, Herod's line of Jewish kings, had been a disaster. Therefore, it was easy to make them into the villains of the story. While the Romans brutally suppressed and oppressed the Jewish people in the land of Palestine, it was the capitulation to the Romans by Herod and his ilk that was seen as the roots of what had become their destruction. Herod himself added to the misery of the Jewish people by increasing taxation so that he might build cities and palaces and expansions to the temple that sought to match or exceed the construction projects already increasing taxes and their projects that the Romans had all around the land of Israel, or what the Romans called Palestine. So during this whole era, the people were doubly taxed by Rome and by Herod. It was a brutal time for the average Israelite. It was a weight so much that was too heavy to take. And this led to revolutions. And the revolution led to destruction. Therefore, though Rome inflicted the destruction, Herod was the one to blame. This story of the slaughter of the innocents may or may not have actually happened. It's debatable that even Herod would go to such lengths, and there are no objective historical records to support this incident. However, in the imagination and memory of the people hearing this story could easily relate to similar massacres, either real or figurative. Herod represents evil, the darkness of power that will go to any length, even the murder of innocent children, to maintain their position of dominance and control. Within memory of the people who first heard these words from Matthew were the massacres of Masada and the siege of Jerusalem. Throughout the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD, which was recent memory, very recent memory, estimates are that over 1 million people had been killed. The slaughter of the innocents was real, even if not actual. Therefore, the story of Jesus and his family escaping to and becoming refugees in Egypt was an experience to which these first century Palestinian Jews could relate. Because they were alive now, because they had escaped the killing, because they themselves were refugees, they could relate to this image, this story of Jesus and his family laying low in Egypt. It was how the people of Israel had survived. This was their story again and again and again, escaping destruction and becoming refugees, a remnant. They were once again in this first century diaspora, a scattered and wandering people in the wilderness of uncertainty, failed by their leaders and kings, but still guided, claimed, and even loved by the God of Israel. As they had in the past, they would once again sustain and survive, reclaiming and reforming based in their faith in Yahweh alone. They would once again be the people of God and be that light to the nations that they have been called out to be. The question they struggled with at this time was, as I have said, which path would they choose? Matthew's gospel is a proposition that the way of Jesus is the path, is the hope, is the light of God, which they should follow through this new wilderness. Jesus Christ was born to be their king. He had lived as they had lived, experienced the persecution that they had experienced in every way, and had been a faithful leader, seeking an alternate way to challenge both the power of Rome and the capitulation and corruption of the Jewish leaders. Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of Heaven, who would be their King, their Lord, their light. And though he had died on a cross, he had risen from the dead and would reign faithfully and eternally, bringing forth the promised and prophesied kingdom of heaven on earth. So this is how hope, good news, gospel is found in this story of hopelessness and exile for the people who originally heard this story of Matthew's refugee Jesus. But what about today? How is this story heard today as a part of the Christmas story? Not necessarily by those of us who sit comfortably in 21st century America, but by the millions of refugees who still struggle to find and follow a light in the darkness of their current and present reality. According to the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the mid-year report of 2013, there are over 11 million refugees, probably more now, and another 20 million plus internally displaced people globally. These are record numbers for the statisticians of the UNHCR. These statistics represent families who have had to leave their home because of violence, war, drought, famine, but mostly violence. There are persons on every continent of almost every religion, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, of many races, of many ethnic origins, of such diversity. Yet among the things that they all have in common is that they are primarily young. Of the 31 million currently displaced persons, the majority of them are children, just as Jesus was. Imagine the impact of the refugee experience on children and on their parents. Consider Joseph and Mary's experience of fear, of fleeing from Bethlehem, of securing passage through the Sinai, of being strangers in a strange land. And even years later, when they decided or were guided to return to Israel, of still being afraid to go home to Judea and instead settling in Galilee. The common experience of the refugees is fear. The common experience of the refugee is uncertainty. The common experience of the refugee is insecurity. Now imagine what this does to children. Human development specialists confirm that amongst the most important elements for normal human development among children is a sense of security, a sense of certainty, a sense of stability. Just those elements that are absent in the refugee experience. Listen to this reporter's story about a 7-year-old refugee from the war in Syria, as reported by Danielle Dell'Orto, who's the senior producer of CNN's medical unit. She and Dr. Sanjay Gupta traveled to Lebanon in September to meet refugees who had been forced from their homes in nearby Syria by the violence there. And here's her look at how the trip affected her. Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. I never imagined I would find myself in Lebanon on the outskirts of the brutal civil war in Syria. As a 32-year-old woman from Chicago, I didn't know what to expect. When I got on the plane last week, it seemed that U.S. or Allied airstrikes on Syria were imminent, and honestly, it was pretty scary. But the fear I felt about the possibility of airstrikes was put into perspective when I met 7-year-old Abdel in a Syrian refugee camp on the Lebanese border with Syria. I will never forget the first time I looked into his eyes. The sadness and fear I saw there were years beyond his age, reflecting the extreme violence and horror he has witnessed, sights and sounds of war that most of the world will only see in the movies. For the 7 days I was there, most of the kids in the camp followed us in a gaggle, circling us at times, giggling and practicing their English, hello and thank you. They loved to see their images on my camera's display screen after I took their picture. Not Abdel. He stood off to the side, only glancing occasionally at the other kids following our crew around. He lingered nearby most of the day, but didn't talk to me or anyone else. When I sat down on a curb, I motioned for him to join me. I think I saw a smirk. We just sat at first. He didn't talk. Then via my translator sitting beside me, I asked Abdel if he liked Tweety Bird, the cartoon character on the t-shirt he was wearing. He shrugged, saying he had never seen that cartoon. They didn't have a television in his 2-bedroom home in Syria, he told me, and of course there's not one in the 10 by 10 foot cement floor refugee tent he shares with his mom and 2 brothers in the camp. In Syria he went to school, 1st grade, he proudly tells me, and played outside with his friends for fun. But that was before the war. I asked Abdel if it still felt safe to play outside in Syria. He shook his head no, and held out his misshapen right arm. He broke it running from a gunfight, he said. It looks as though he didn't receive any medical care for his injury. The bone's healed so out of place he can't bend his arm all the way or lay it out straight. It wasn't Abdel's injury that led his family to leave its home for an uncertain future, a life as refugees. It was an explosion just weeks later that left his 4-year-old brother severely burned. Abdel's dad told them to flee, get to the border until the violence subsides, he said. Abdel's father stayed behind to work and protect the family's modest home, a scenario common to many of the refugees I met. That was 4 months ago. Abdel now carries the title of man of the house. The worry in his eyes is constant. The weight he is carrying is so heavy, I felt it just sitting next to him. Abdel now sleeps on the cement floor of the family's tent in a strange place with none of the familiarity of home. He showed me the virtually empty living space containing a plastic chair, a few blankets, a bucket. His baby brother is extremely malnourished. Abdel himself is painfully thin. His last meal was yesterday, he said. He ate rice. Meeting Abdel and hundreds of other refugees in just this one camp and hearing their stories makes me fear the effect that potential U.S. or Allied airstrikes would have. I worry that more fighting will only lead to more pain for children like Abdel. The numbers are already horrific. More than 100,000 Syrians have been killed, many of them women and children. In the latest atrocity, as many as 1,400 died in August in a chemical weapons attack, allegedly by the government. I volunteered to travel to the Syrian border to help CNN tell the stories of the people who've been impacted by this wrenching conflict. The violence has pushed more than 6 million Syrians from their homes to other cities inside Syria or out of the country. And more than half of the refugees, some 4 million, are under the age of 17. When I met them and heard the horrors they've lived through, it made me see that the human consequences of the war are compounding. Would outside military action really stop that? While limited airstrikes might reduce the risk of another chemical attack, they might also spur more fighting and violence within Syria. It could take what's left of Abdel's home and maybe even take away his dad. But then again, the same could happen without international intervention. I don't know what the solution is, but I know there has to be a way to help Abdel and the thousands of others like him. I encourage you to go online and to read stories of other refugees. A story I specifically recommend is a story in a recent New York Times magazine about refugees from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria seeking refuge on the ironically named Christmas Island off the coast of Australia. These people are seeking hope on Christmas and being turned away. How ironic. I encourage you to read this and other stories of refugees, and in these stories, try to find the gospel. Try to find light in the darkness. Try to find the hope. Even 2,000 years after Jesus became a refugee, it isn't easy. But it's there. Remember that Jesus' birth, life, and even death represent a different perspective and a different understanding of the power dynamics of the world. No matter how powerful and dark the current realities may seem, these are just an illusion. For the real power comes in love, in grace, in light, in hope. What I've realized is that just choosing to become a refugee, these people's horrible choice that they are making, is about hope. Their choice, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph's choice, was a statement about hope. If you read the stories of refugees, the common thread that leads them to leave their current untenable situation is the hope that somewhere out there in the world is a place where they might actually find security, stability, peace. It's a hope that Jesus' parents had for him, and a hope that every parent among the 30 million refugees in our world today has. It is what they cling to. It is what they long for. That somewhere they can find a place where their children might live in peace, where they might find justice, where they might more than just survive, where they might be at home. In this story, in the story of refugees throughout the ages, through the right lens and perspective, we can find that glimmer of hope, that light shining in the darkness that begins John's gospel. It is the hope that the current powers, the current realities, the current situation is not forever. This too shall pass. Now is not for always. There is a power beyond darkness, beyond evil, beyond hopelessness. There is a light in the darkness. It is a light that Jesus took and fanned into a flame. And even when the powers that be tried to destroy it, to suppress it, to wipe it out, the same light was taken up by others and continues to shine throughout the world. Even in the darkest corner of the most forsaken refugee camp, there is a light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not and will not overcome it. That is the light, the hope, the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. May it shine in and through our lives, through the church, and through people of faiths, of all faiths, into the darkest corners and most hopeless situations throughout God's creation.